I still see some people joining, so we'll give it maybe 2 minutes and then we'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
Hey Mary, if you throw whatever you have in the Q&A, I can answer it for you there.
Hello and welcome to tonight's Daniel Island Historical Society meeting, our speaker series. I am very excited about tonight's program, and I will go ahead and turn this over to Beth, who will do our speaker introduction tonight, and I look forward to hearing all that Mr. Grant has to say here.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this program, our last in our spring series. Jessica's done a fabulous job getting our speakers lined up, and we're especially excited about tonight. It's a very timely topic, as we've been promoting in some of our posts about this program. I want to tell you just real quick how I know our speaker, and I really knew of him before I met him. And that's through my work with the Daniel Island News. As some of you may know, I'm a writer for the paper, and I love writing about history in our area. And I was fortunate enough to interview Grant a few weeks ago. First time we spoke, actually. Again, I had heard of him long before and some of his work and the research that he does. And I was just blown away by our conversation and his knowledge of cemeteries, of African-American burial grounds. And he taught me a lot about Daniel Island, and I thought I already knew a lot about Daniel Island. I found out I don't. So I was super excited to talk with him, and I really am so thrilled that he's going to be sharing some of the research he's done and just some of the fabulous insights he has about these important sacred spaces and why we really should pay attention and focus on them. So Grant, the title that he gave me in our interview, and I also see is listed on his little bio here, is forensic historian, which I think is really cool. It sounds really cool. Who doesn't want to be a forensic historian? And he's also a genealogical researcher for the Gullah Society. And the Gullah Society is a nonprofit that was created to assist those seeking to reconnect with their Gullah heritage, African history, and culture. Founded many years ago by the late Dr. Ade Afunian, or Dr. O, who has ancestors buried on Daniel Island, and now he himself is buried on Daniel Island. And he was the one who introduced me just in talking about Grant and how much he loved Grant, was impressed with Grant, and spoke very, very highly of him. Grant's got a couple other things that he does as well. He's involved with the African American Cemetery Restoration Project, the Anson Street Burial Ground Project. He is a 9th generation South Carolinian of French Protestant ancestors. They settled in Old Jamestown in the Orange Quarter of Berkeley County in the 1690s, so they go way back. He's a retired firefighter with 25 years on the job. So thank you for your service, Grant, on that. He's been working on cemeteries and genealogy for 30 plus years. So he definitely knows what he's talking about. He lives in Somerville with his wife, Stephanie, and 2 sons, Tristan and Logan. And we're just honored and just feel so privileged to have you, Grant. Thank you so much. Can't wait to hear your presentation.
Thank you. So you just go ahead and go then?
Yep. You start whenever you're ready.
Oh, well, I've been doing, I really got interested in genealogy from my stepmother, who was adopted. And she started doing it. And I started backtracking my family and checking, and, you know, one thing leads to another. And I really got interested in the old plantation cemeteries and these country cemeteries. And I started doing research on them and collecting data, and never really thought anybody would be interested in it, just collecting it for myself. And I was actually able to connect with some family members of extended family members and descendants of these members of some of these cemeteries. And they were absolutely ecstatic. They had no idea. So it kind of gave me a purpose. And then I found out about Dr. O'Funnion, and we connected right off the bat. So at that time, I'd been doing a bunch of studying on downtown Charleston and the cemeteries that are in the Peninsula area of downtown Charleston. And there are a lot of cemeteries in downtown Charleston. I'll talk more about them in a little bit. But I spread out doing Daniels Island and Allendale and Mount Pleasant. And one of the things I was really interested in was the St. T. Cooper project, the lakes that filled in over the top of cemeteries. And through my research, I've discovered maps that were done by the Corps of Engineers on all of that area before they were flooded, showing the location of all the cemeteries. And I've GPS coordinated all those cemeteries onto a current map showing all the ones that are under the lakes. You know, they're out in the middle of the blue, but this is where they were at. And in those records, they had information on the cemeteries that they had dug up and then reinterred in other places. So we had lists of names or just list of unknown burials, but where they were reinterred at. So all this, majority of these were African-American cemeteries. And when I started doing downtown, Charleston goes way back. And originally Charleston was a walled city. And the walled city part was the lower, if you're looking at the map from above, it's the lower right corner of the peninsula, the French Quarter area. And they had churches inside the wall, but they buried the first public cemetery, unofficial public cemetery, was the Strangers Burial Ground that was outside of the city walls. And I have a map and I'll show you. And they had these plantations and farms and outside the walls, but as the city expanded and grew, it expanded over the top of those cemeteries and covered those cemeteries up. So a lot of those cemeteries were lost. Between Pittsburgh Avenue and the top of the neck area and the tip of the battery, and from river to river, that section of the peninsula is roughly 7.5 square miles. And in that 7.5 square miles, I have documented 113 recorded cemeteries. A majority of which, about 80% are African-American, of which about 90% are destroyed parking lots, empty lots, roads, churches on top of them, various other issues. But the majority of the area that has the most in it is in where Magnolia Cemetery and Bethany is, that belt across the neck area. I can't remember the exact year, but Charleston made it a law that you could not bury anybody inside the city limits anymore. So that's when the cemeteries above Mount Pleasant Street, which was the city boundary at the time, started coming to fruition. Now, Bethany and Magnolia had already been there because that was the old Magnolia Umbra plantation area. But then you start having the smaller ones that are all the African-American cemeteries, and there were some Jewish cemeteries up there, as well as the Moore Street Cemetery, the one that we recently cleaned. And it basically stretches from river to river across that section, the 3-mile section of Charleston. And in the process of working on other cemeteries downtown, 88 Smith Street was a residence that just privately sold, and we were working to try to purchase that property, and it did not come to fruition. 88 Smith Street and the property behind it at one time was actually 2 different cemeteries that were outside the city walls, but later on became inside the city limit. And in that area, that is about, I say about 15,000 to 20,000, no, about 25,000 square feet. There's roughly 3,600 graves in those 2 sections. And I met Brian Turner with the Preservation Society working through this. And while this was going on, that is when Brian Turner called me and asked me if I would assist them with the cemetery in Cainhoy, the old ruined cemetery. And that's when I became acquainted with the whole Cainhoy crew, Miss Skinner and all that. Now, I had been in that cemetery a long time ago. I'd always heard there was graves on the outside of the fence, but I never went back in there because it was all private property. And but I knew that inside the cemetery had historical influence. Like there's some Revolutionary War soldiers in there, as well as General William Moultrie setting up a hospital in the old church in 1780 during the evacuation of Charleston. So I knew that the potential of Revolutionary War soldiers being buried there during 1780 there's a high probability, but I did know that there are several soldiers that were buried in there after they passed away in old age. And but this was the white section of the cemetery. And it wasn't until later on that when I started with the group with this situation is going on now that I realized the extent of the African-American cemetery on the outside. And through that research, we've determined that there's about 57 extra graves outside the fence that we know of that are documented. 10 of those are probable because they have family members that are buried in there, and their death certificates list Cainhoy, South Carolina as the burial area. So we have those as probable. So through affidavits, death certificates, and various other names that the cemetery went by, like Village Cemetery, Cainhoy Village Cemetery, Wando Village Cemetery, and that we've determined there's about 47 that we're almost for certain that are buried there. The historical report that was done, which relied on other information from another historical report, which was kind of haphazardly done. The second one was, they list 13 marked or 13 known graves in one section outside the fence. And when I started checking the death certificates and going through the newspaper obituaries and stuff, I found 16 death certificates with McDowell Cemetery listed as the burial area. So that's 3 additional than they even had listed. Plus, with a grave, if you take an 8x4 grave, that's 7x3 foot for the casket, and that's a half foot boundary around the outside. You put 2 graves together, you have a foot between. If you pack those in there as tight as you can, it takes up 3/4 of that area. And we know no cemetery is ever straight, especially in the country. And the burials they have listed are sporadic through that area. So you have to look at old maps, how the road was before, because originally the Clements Ferry Road originally ran up the Cooper River. It did not run where Clements Ferry runs now. There was some dirt roads that interconnected one another, but the main Clements Ferry Road is basically closed off now, but it followed the Cooper River up to St. Thomas Church and then connected in where Cainhoy Road is now. So you have to look at old maps and see how the ground was laid before. And in doing that, you have to compare plat records and deeds. And the one thing that I'm having a lot of issues with right now, especially in the Cainhoy area, is multiple names being used for the same cemetery. And so I'm trying to disseminate some of those. One of the main ones we have is you have the Grove Cemetery behind the tennis center, but then you have the Grove Plantation Center up near the chemical plant up on Cainhoy Road. And a lot of people online have gotten the two cemeteries mixed up, putting people in the other cemetery that's not supposed to be there, find a grave, that type thing. So I've been trying to go back and disseminate those people and figure out who's buried in what. And it's quite daunting when you don't have a lot of information. So you'll follow, and if I find out, one person, Joe Smith, and he died this day, and this is his death certificate number, and here's his parents, and here's who he's married to. Well, then the next person I'm gonna look to see if he's buried in that cemetery is gonna be his parents. If his parents are buried in there, and then I'm gonna look for his death certificate or death information, see if I find out his parents are buried in there. And then also see if he had any children or if his wife was buried in there. So that's how you kind of spread out these cemeteries and try to figure out who may exactly be buried in there. Now that doesn't help with the sporadic single burial of a person that may have been in town and died and was friends of an area. He passed away and they buried him in the cemetery. I've run into several of those, but even if I tried, even if we had all the information in the world, I doubt we'd ever be able to find every single burial ground or everybody that was buried, especially in the country, because when it came to children, babies, young children, older elderly folks that were sickly, lots of times they would pass away and they would just bury them in the cemetery and not even report it to the coroner. Especially when it came to children, stillborns, and young children that passed away in their infancy. They would just make a homemade coffin and the family would bury them. Sometimes they would report them to the coroner, and the coroner would list the person, what they died of and everything, and in the burial area just said family, homemade casket. So there'd be no funeral home working with the family or anything like that. So can I get so I can share some stuff on the screen?
Absolutely. You should be able to click the green button down there on screen.
Okay, all right, 1 second. All right, can everybody see this now?
Yep, we can see the spreadsheet.
Okay. This here is burials that were listed on death certificates or listed in obituaries as people being buried in Cainhoy. And this ranges from 1870 to I think 1940. And I want to say there's almost 300 that just have Cainhoy, South Carolina listed as where they were buried. Now, Daniels Island is the same way. This is people that died with Daniels Island or Daniel Island listed on their death certificate. And I think there's 190 of these. And these are people that are supposed to be buried somewhere on Daniels Island. Now, whether that's considered what Daniels Island considered now, where the Alston Cemetery is at, or whether that's just on Daniels Island itself, or how far that extended, we're not exactly sure, because I have no idea where a majority of these people are buried. It just said Daniels Island. A lot of these might be unmarked burials in some of these churches and other cemeteries and that type of thing. But let me see here. All right, this right here is the Grove Cemetery. This is the one that is behind the tennis center where Dr. O'Funyun is buried at. These are the people that I have listed buried in there. And, oh, it's stepped over, I'm sorry. But you go to Grove Plantation here, this is Grove Plantation Cemetery. And these are people that have buried in Grove Plantation Cemetery, which is way up, about halfway up Cainhoy Road. So that issue with the different names of the cemeteries is sometimes a problem. Or one year the cemetery was called this and another year it was called that. Or a phoneticized spelling of the name. Case in point, I've discovered another cemetery on Daniels, well, it's actually on St. Thomas Island. And I actually found it on a plat, and it's called the Clements Ferry Cemetery. And here's the people listed on the Clements Ferry Cemetery. And but as I was looking, if I would find a obituary, it had like Janie Middleton in her obituary said Readyfoot Cemetery. Well, Readyfoot could be confused with Redford. And I do know that this gentleman here, Reverend Henry Rivers, he was buried, it said Clements Ferry on his obituary, but it said Readyfoot on his death certificate. So all these might be the exact same name, or it might be a conglomeration of a couple of different ones. That's where the researcher come in and try to determine that. Now, where I have, let me see here. All right. Now I had it listed down as a slave cemetery because it was an older cemetery. It might very well be an African-American cemetery, but a lot of cemeteries that were enslaved cemetery before emancipation continue to be used afterwards. And here is this is Beresford Creek. It was also called Ferry Creek. And here is the property line. There's the graveyard right there. Now, when we go to a map, where this is at, is right here. That's where that cemetery is, right there. And at the end of Clements Ferry Road was right here. Here's where the ferry came out at. And the ferry went across and came in where Clement Ferry Road here is, or Clements Road, used to come out when this was no Navy base. Here, and it would come here, and there was a tavern down here called Calais Tavern. So this area had a lot of people coming in and out of it. And this is where that cemetery is supposed to be, in that general, excuse me, right here, in this general vicinity right here. Now, using these things, and I like Google Maps because you can do 3D on it, and you can look 360 degrees around. Bing Maps also does that, old aerial maps, as well as the old topographical maps, which are extremely helpful, especially when it comes to the location of cemeteries, because in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, on these maps, they started listing burial grounds. And here is Cainhoy, and there's a cemetery there. There's a cemetery here. There's another cemetery right here, and this cemetery is actually the Wando United Methodist Church Cemetery. There's McDowell Cemetery. There's another unknown cemetery here. There's Nellyfield Creek Cemetery here, and there's sporadically more throughout here. So you'll find these cemeteries that nobody knew about that is just maybe homes or something like that on there now. But it takes a bunch of different sources to compare back and forth to come up with a singular thing. And even then, you might have to go on a hunch or have to set it to the side. And I think I did one, I couldn't find it, and I completely forgot about it for about 20 years. And I found some information that basically blew the lid off the case and was able to determine exactly where the cemetery was at. Let me see here. All right, this here is with the Anson Street Burial Project at Gullah Society. We started, I started a thing called Charleston Mortuary Geography. And this is basically the cemeteries that are listed as being in the Peninsula of Charleston, the 113. And I did this map like this right here so you can see it better. And you'll be able to see the progression of the city, looking at their burial grounds and how the city grew and everything. This right here is all the for the most part, the white church cemeteries and the large white burial grounds. This is like St. Philip, St. Michael's, the St. John's Lutheran, the Circular Church, Universalist Church. And then you have the African-American churches, and the majority of these are up here. This is all in that neck area. And then next one is African-American funeral homes. They would have sometimes burial grounds. There's a few of those. But then you had the charitable associations like the Brown Fellowship and McPhala and Ephrath and that type thing. And that's them here. Monrovia is the big one. Then there's several family burial grounds that are sporadic in there. But the big ones in downtown Charleston were the public cemeteries, the Potter's Fields. And that is here. These are the public cemeteries in downtown Charleston. This is the Citadel Complex, Harmon Field, that type thing. This right here is where the Medical University, the Horseshoe and everything is. This here is the entire city block between Calhoun and Vanderhorst and St. Philip's and Cummings Street, where the parking garage and everything is. And this right here is the old city jail. Now, when I go, let me change my map here. You can see how these grounds were exactly what parts of the town it covers. That whole block where the old jail is a cemetery. And then this cemetery here is the first one, and it's in this shape because the city walls came right through here and they were buried on the outside of the wall. And then the next one was this one here. This is between Vanderhorst, Cummins, St. Philip's, and Calhoun. This is basically where the FedEx box is, in the St. Philip Street parking garage. And then after that, we went to here, and this is basically B Street. This is where Porter Military Academy used to be at. The old Medical University with the Horseshoe and everything out front right here. This whole section right here was public burial ground. This is the area where I think Denmark Vesey was buried. Also Lavinia Fisher was buried here. And after they shut this down, they created this one here. Now, these other ones, this was a family cemetery right here, the O'Neill Cemetery. This was the Mariners Cemetery for seamen and that type. And then the orange area was the burial ground for the Ashley River Asylum, or the Ashley River Old Folks Home. It was over right here in this general vicinity. It was an old, decrepit, last place to stick old people whenever nobody could take care of them type thing. It was very horrible conditions, and a lot of people with the death certificates died of emaciation and want of vitality. And my favorite is visitation of God. They'd have no idea what they died of, so they just said God visited them and touched them, and they were dead. That's what they put in the death certificates. But out here, this is where they started making the rule about burying past Mount Pleasant Street, which is a city line right here. So all these cemeteries, this is Cal Kadash Beth Elohim Synagogue Cemetery, this is Bethany, this is St. Lawrence, this is Magnolia, and here's a lot of the African American churches and Fellowship Society cemeteries here, and right here, actually I don't have it here, but there's a cemetery right here they built on top of, and this is the cemetery we were just working with on Monrovia Street and Union Baptist Church. This whole area now is pretty much clean, and so I did this a while back, and then I started on plotting the different county burial grounds. So what I have here is the cemeteries of Berkeley County, and these are the ones I have documented so far, but I think I have pretty much a majority of the ones in the Cainhoy Wando area, and these are the ones that I have here, and these are the Cainhoy Wando area. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the cemetery, the little cemetery that is on Captain's Island, of the one gravestone that was there over Rodin's Island. Well, that grave is now gone. It was disinterred and is being reinterred in another cemetery. And because the homeowner on the property or whatever. The strange thing is, when they disinterred the grave, it looks as if the grave had already been disinterred. They found, it looked as if the grave had been dug up and then filled back in a long time ago. So they found no bones or anything like this. They just packaged the dirt up, and they're going to bury the dirt because for the most part, the grave the remains may have disintegrated and everything, but they're pretty sure that it looks like the grave had already been disinterred. But here is where the Clements Ferry Cemetery is, and on up, you have all these little cemeteries. But then you get up here, and these two cemeteries here, I'm not exactly sure of the exact location. One is called the Grover Cemetery, and the other one we don't know the name of. Because they're in this general vicinity, people have told us they know they're out there somewhere, but we've got to get out there and find them. This one here is a cemetery that the St. Paul's Church uses. This was recently rediscovered. This is Nellyfield. And here is Wando, there's McDowell here, in these cemeteries here. So we put this over and we start looking on the list. When I list the, and what I call these is my forensic audit. When I start looking at the people that are buried, and so we'll go to McDowell Cemetery right here. Here's the ones we know listed in McDowell. We had affidavits that were signed by people in the community that listed certain members of their family buried in there. So we have some of those by affidavit. We have some that are verified by cemetery names that also known as McDowell, or another cemetery name that was used for the same area. Also ones that were verified by death certificate or obituary, that type thing. So then when you look, I actually do I have it on this one here? Okay. The more extensive one I have, and I don't have it on here, I would list the persons, like Virginia McDowell Clifford. Her mother and father were Robinson or Robert McDowell and Celia Wright McDowell. That was her parents. So when I would have them down, I would look and try to see if any of those in there, and sure enough, we know they're in. We're pretty sure they're in there. And then Ruth McDowell was another child. Then Joseph S. Clifford was actually the young son of Virginia. So we know they're all buried in there. So then you just basically disseminate through it. And once you get that, start doing them, sometimes you might have, as I ran into here, people that are, I have to list them as possible because like the Frasers and the Thaleys here, but it only lists Cainhoy, South Carolina, but we know Daniel Faley Jr., his father, is buried in there because it was called the Cainhoy Cemetery, but his son, Josh Faley was the dad, and this one here, Daniel was the son. So we're pretty sure that both of them, at least one, we know for one, but we're pretty sure the other one's buried in there too. But we had those set to the side as possibilities. And with those taken out, we're numbered about 47. So we're glad DHEC put a stop to it right now so we can do the extra research on it to determine the extent of the graves. That's one of the things that's my main focus, is to help the communities, but also try to be an arbitrator and assist the developers, because in the long run, would be saving the developer money. Take into account the Gilliard Center, when they found the remains of the cemetery that was under it back in 2013, they had to shut down for several weeks. And that was a lot of money shutting down. If they would have known about it previous, something else could be done about it, but it was kind of something that was there. We thought it was undiscovered cemetery previously, but I did find a newspaper article back from the 20s where before Anson or George Street was put through behind it, they were doing some work on a sewage line and they found some old bones, and it was exactly the same cemetery, but they just reburied them, saying it was just an old grave, and that was the only mention of it.
Hey, Grant, real quick, we got a question from Bill Payer. Basically, the question is with respect to recourse over some of these things. So like in the case of the Cainhoy old ruins graves, what happens if a developer accidentally paves over or, otherwise obliterates a grave outside the fence?
Well, that's interesting. That's a good question. There's such thing as called inadvertent discovery, but inadvertent discovery for the most part is, when DHEC does your permit and then you go working on the property, doing your property and everything, and then bam, you hit a grave like they did at the Gilliard, you're supposed to stop and then notify DHEC, because you've just discovered something that was above and beyond what was known previously to the permit being issued. That's what they call inadvertent discovery. Sometimes developers don't report those when they dig into them. What we had here is, so the developer wouldn't get in trouble if they hit a grave that was not known about, as long as they reported to DHEC, so the research could be done on it. Now, what was different about Cainhoy Cemetery is that there were graves known to be outside the fence, and they were located on the plat map that was done by the cultural consultant. The problem is there was that area had not been on that side been properly documented or searched with ground penetrating radar, prodding, or anything like that. Plus, in between, being it's in the city of Charleston, but it's also in the county, Berkeley County, there was some loss of translation between the city authorities and the county authorities, and a plat that the corporation from the Old Ruins Church Corporation had, showing a 25-foot wide easement being approved, and in the deed and the plat basically had been completely overlooked and eradicated without any input from the cemetery people. And Miss Skinner had made numerous attempts And she'd been working on this thing for about 20 years through different developers. She'd made numerous attempts to come in contact with these guys, let them know, but she was basically being brushed off. And that's when she got the Preservation Society involved, and that's when they asked me to come be involved. So when it got into it, I did the forensic audit, found the number of graves that were possibly in there, and tried to show them this. But basically, by everything that the developer was supposed to do, he had done it. It was some loss of information or misstep or something between approving the permit, that type thing. We're not exactly sure what happened, but when the information got approved, he basically had his permit in place and could start digging, unless inadvertent discovery happened and you found evidence that there was possible graves there. Now, I had a stack of death records, but what it took was actually the photographs of the sunken graves in the area. Now, my understanding was they weren't supposed to start doing any work on that area until after a meeting they were supposed to have with some representatives from the group. That's what I was told, but then they started lumbering the area like on Wednesday or Thursday and stripping trees out. And we went there. That's when we had the news conference that evening. The thing is if they had not stripped the trees out, we never would have seen the sunken graves as clear as we did because of the overgrowth. So they actually did us a favor by cleaning the trees out, so we're able to take pictures of what we think are sunken graves. That information was introduced and sent to DHEC, and that's when DHEC conversed with the state archaeological office in South Carolina, the state historic preservation office, and they issued a cease and stop order till a further archaeological research could be done on the property. So that when it comes to, if you don't know of anything on your property, you're not even thinking about it, and you find a grave, if you report it, there's going to be no issue whatsoever. But if you know of a graveyard and you know there's a possible extent of more graves, but do nothing about it, and then until you uproot a grave, then yes, you could get in trouble with that, because the thing about it is once you desecrate a grave, it's nothing but recovery and repair after that. The grave has been desecrated. It's been busted open by equipment, different things like that. And we would rather not do that and have other means of finding if there are anomalies that are graves. Ground penetrating radar is a good use. The thing with ground penetrating radar is ground penetrating radar will give you a image of an anomaly under the ground at a certain depth that is indicative with what a grave would look like. You would have to do something above and beyond that, such as like scraping the top layer of the dirt away and see if you can find the rectangular grave shaft, because the dirt is discolored, different from the outside dirt, the one's been agitated, prodding with metal prods. Take, for instance, if you're in the middle of a field and you know there's supposed to be a cemetery in the middle of a field, and you go out there and you find between the 4 and 6 foot depth, you find what you think might be a grave. It's a rather, large anomaly. It could be a grave, it could be what's left of a tree stump, it could be anything. But if you go in the middle of that same field and you start finding bam, 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 side by side, like on these graves here, there's a good chance you found the graveyard. So, but just because it pops up on the screen don't necessarily mean it's a grave, but you have to take into other information, such as the repetitive repeating the anomalies, or location per se. If you have a fancy GPR and you go one way and then you scan it the other direction, it hooks to the satellite link, and it'll tell you the bearing of the graves, how it lies, like on the east-west boundary. And if you find on the east-west boundary, you find several of them, there's a good chance that's a cemetery, because the east-west is Christian, for Christian burials. And So, there's a bunch of different things you have to go into, but there are some people out there that will not report these, and there's a lot of people that do report them. As I was working on the cemetery on Monrovia Street, I was asked by somebody. I was on my face, on my stomach, down on the ground, trying to dig out a gravestone that had fallen. It was the middle of August. I was sweating. I was nasty. And this person asked me, said, "Why are you interested in working in graves of people that are not your own race?" So immediately I was like, now they could have asked it like, "Why are you interested in working in African American cemeteries?" But the way they answered it, I said, "Well, if you look over that direction there, you'll see the Harriet Street on-ramp. And those gravestones are right into the wall over there. South Carolina DOT, they didn't build on top of the cemetery, but they didn't waste any space." And they said, "Yeah, I see that." I said, "Well, you don't see them building I-26 through Magnolia Cemetery, where I know some of your family's buried at." And that was the end of the conversation. So that answered the question that they could get in trouble if they don't report it or if they don't know about it. Was that good?
Yeah, no, that I think that answered. I think the real heart of the question, though, is do you have a sense of how often people just brush these things under the rug, or if SC actually goes after these people, or is it just
It's it happens. I can't tell you it happens every day, but I know I've been involved in multiple incidences of this. Now, this would happen to be tried over Mount Pleasant and Remley's Point, and the Scanlonville Cemetery, Remley's Point Cemetery, is an old cemetery. That's the Freedmen's Village that was built right after emancipation. And what happens with African American cemeteries is lots of times the ones in the country, they kind of grow back and get overgrown and are still used. They'll trot in there and dig a grave and put the grave down, and kind of a go back to nature thing. And these people who purchased the property, and in South Carolina, basically it's very antiquated. All you have to do to attempt to move a cemetery is put a 30-day notice in the newspaper that you're going to move these graves, and there's 30-day notice for any family members, anybody that might have any complaints or anything with it. If there is no newspaper, then it literally says you are to nail it up in an area that is prominent, such as the courthouse door. So that's pretty antiquated.
I should say so, yeah. In this day and age.
So when that goes by, of course, when they did that, the neighborhood went berserk. They had no idea the property had been sold, and they went back and forth with people, and eventually went to court. And the court found in favor of the community. So they had saved the cemetery, and it actually set a precedence for future possible litigation that about these cemeteries and the condition these cemeteries go in. That a lot of these cemeteries that are supposed to be old and abandoned aren't necessarily old and abandoned. That type thing. But taking all that out of the play, it's just the moral responsibility that if you find a cemetery or grave or what you think might be a grave, let's report it. It's just you wouldn't be doing that to your grandparents' graves. You wouldn't be doing that to your great-grandparents' graves.
Absolutely. And Robert Morgan just piped in saying, if you find any human remains, you should report that to the county sheriff and the coroner as well.
Exactly. It's just a moral obligation of a human being that if that was your grave, you wouldn't want anybody doing that to you. Now, some people might not care about that, but it's just common sense and common decency.
Now, another attendee has a question. They had a great aunt who died in childbirth along with the baby. They were buried together. Unless the family's aware of it, is there any way to tell if more than one person is buried in a single grave? So, like, if somebody died in childbirth, is there a good way to tease out, they might have a, stillborn baby with them?
In the death record, most likely, where did this occur at? Did they say where it happened at?
Don't know. Although if you say in the question and answer, I can read it out too. But
yeah, most likely they'd be buried in a especially back in unless you were affluent and had a lot of money, it saved money to bury him in the same coffin. You know, that's one thing. Plus, it's the sheer fact that this mother had the child and they both passed away, and they would bury him together. I doubted if they would bury him in separate ones. And if there was death certificates that were done, they'd both say they were buried, such if they were buried in Magnolia Cemetery. But if you look at their records and there's only listing of the mom being buried in there, then it's a pretty good chance that the baby was buried with the mom.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
But
Mike
if the person's out there that asked that question, if they would like to hold on afterwards, I can get some information. I can try to backtrack it and see if I can find any information on it to determine that for them. I have no problem with doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just throw that up in the. Mike Dahlman has a few things here. A couple of comments. One, earliest gravestone for Daniel Island is for a 9-month-old Lesney. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah.
Yeah, Lesane. That's from the old. I think that he's talking about the old Lesane burial ground over on the other side of the tennis center. I do believe that's the original plantation cemetery for the family.
He also noted that there appears to be a cemetery on St. Thomas Road that you don't have listed. It's separate from the Marianne Church Cemetery. So that's maybe something we can circle up back on after the presentation. Is, you know, there might be information there.
Yes, please, because we find stuff like this, and we have these cemeteries we don't know about, and this one here that's in Clements Ferry Road might not be the Clements Ferry Cemetery. It might be something like this, and this other one might be some unknown slave cemetery.
Yeah, so let me connect you two up afterwards.
Okay, that sounds good.
Seen this Clements Ferry Cemetery. Was told by the neighbor that they moved grave markers to make the area smaller than it was. That's interesting. Apparently, anecdotally, people have been like moving grave markers in Clements Ferry. That's low class, but you know. Mike wanted to reach out and also say he's got a lot of resources out in his Daniel Island book, and you know he wanted to offer to go through the Daniel Island book and share some of his resources.
I'm compiling these lists. I have not quite finished all the pertinent data with the families and different things like that. I do have their names and their death dates. Eventually, when I get that finished, I'll give the information out. That's not an issue. And as you go through them, the thing about compiling data is sometimes you can compile it, and then you come to a certain area where you have to stop because there's nothing else available. But then as years go by, time goes by, something else is digitized to put out there, or somebody opens up somebody's, box in the attic or whatever, more information pops out. So you can put that together. Or if, like this Clements Ferry Cemetery, I'm assuming right now it's just that this one down here is the Clements Ferry Cemetery, but I have it listed as probable, not very sure, because I know there's some other ones around there. So until we can get it 100%, we can find out where it is and find out if that's it, then they won't go and say 100% that is who's buried there. It'd say there is a cemetery there that's possibly this. So
absolutely. No, we can connect you two after the call's over, but okay. That'd be fun seeing you two collaborate. Mike says he has seen the Clements Ferry Cemetery. It's where he says it is. So I guess this is a distinct.
So he said, Mike, he has been on the property down in the Clements Ferry Road and is there.
Yep.
I'm looking at the comment section. Is there gravestones there or just sunken graves? Yes. All right, great. All right, excellent. Okay, I definitely would like to talk with him afterwards.
Yep.
And I have a question, Andrew and Grant. I couldn't type it in for some reason. It won't let me. Can you guys hear me?
That's okay. We can hear you.
Okay. Grant, just a quick question about the African-American burial traditions. I know that was something that was discussed when you discovered these 8 recent soil depressions at old ruins. What were some of the characteristics that you noted? I heard something about plantings and other things that might have been indicative of it being an African-American grave in particular.
Yeah, you go to the middle of standing trees, there's supposed to be a cemetery out there. And if you start seeing sporadic azalea bushes through the trees out there, and there's supposed to be a cemetery somewhere around there. There's a good chance that that's where the cemetery's at, because lots of times people would plant these, we call it grave foliage, like wax myrtles or azaleas or rose bushes, that type thing. And they're out in the country, let the things go wild. You might have a rose bush the size of a Studebaker, you know. So, you know, especially if you have an area that's like pine forest, and then you find these sporadic flowering bushes out in the middle of this place, and there's supposed to be a cemetery, that's a good chance that's where the cemetery's at. Seashells on graves, pottery, porcelain. A lot of that goes with them giving offerings to, or giving stuff, put it on the grave for them to carry into the next life. Another thing is, especially with African American graves, or sometimes you'll find a pipe buried in the ground coming out of the ground, and that was a what it was is the family could go to the grave and talk to their passed away relative through the pipe. And actually, the cemetery that's on Monrovia Street, the Zion Olivet Cemetery, has 2 of those terracotta pipes like that. And that's usually in older graveyards, but those graves were from the early 1900s. So lots of times when I look for cemeteries and there's water or rivers or an ocean, I automatically start looking on the water's edge of the property, because water was a symbol of the way back to Africa. So you'll find a lot of burial grounds along the water's edge. Also, plantation owners, they would, for the most part, they would allow the enslaved people to bury their loved ones in wherever they wanted to bury them. So you didn't have to have a singular graveyard. Not saying everybody was like that, but usually it would be in an area that was not plowed, or that was the possibility of being plowed for making money off crops. You'd be put in an area that you weren't going to plow ever to try to make money off of it. So that's one thing. So you want to look at areas that would not be primed for plowing. So you look at old past maps and that type thing. Or if you have on the coast, you might have a little spit of land that comes out, and like a little piece of land that juts out. That is a prime location for putting these graves. Now, some of these graves are directly on the side of rivers and that type thing through years and years and years of erosion. Some of these graves have washed off, you know, have been opened up and washed off. And there's several cemeteries like that in Charleston County that are like that. And they're just gone through storms, that type of thing. Storm surges rising up. But the porcelain, you'll find one good thing is clock or clock parts. When a person was ill, they would take a clock and put a clock in the room, or if there was a clock in the room, and when that person passed away, they would break the clock or stop the clock at the time of death, and they would put that clock on the grave on top of the grave. And I've got a really good picture from when they were taking the graves out of the hydroelectric lakes up in Berkeley County, and they show one of these graves with this clock that's falling apart on top of it. And when we were in cleaning the Moore Street Cemetery off Oceanic Street, when we were metal detecting the cemetery looking for little metal grave markers, we found clock parts on top of one grave. So it was it's usually with seashells, which meant of another pathway back home through the ocean. Now there's also some speculation, or some people say seashells, if the person was an evil person, that the seashell was there to keep the evil spirit in the shell. But every time I've always had to deal with it, it's just a symbolism of the path home through the ocean, the path home back to Africa when it came to the seashells.
I pushed Mike up to panelist just so you guys can talk briefly if you want to talk on that location.
All right, so Mike, you said you've been to this cemetery down in the Columbus Ferry?
I was probably a lot and a half away.
Okay.
So you could definitely tell the cemetery. The person I was talking to was a homeowner there.
Right.
He'd been talking to somebody that owned that cemetery, or the cemetery is on their land, and they've been moving gravestones to make the thing not seem so big.
So that cemetery, they had been moving gravestones?
Yeah.
Ooh.
But we can't prove it without GPR, and it's private.
Right. Well, that's another thing about private cemeteries on private property. Now, by law in South Carolina, a private property owner that a cemetery is inside and is not a separate piece of property that's individually owned by a church or whatever, but if it's a cemetery that is on private property and you have family members in that property, the people that own that property cannot keep you from visiting that cemetery. It cannot keep you from burying somebody in that cemetery by state law.
Okay.
Now, in that law, the responsibility for the person that's wanting to visit it is you have to notify the homeowner 30 days in advance by letter, and then they have to answer you back within 30 days by letter to determine a time for y'all to come and look at the cemetery and that type of thing. I've only run into one problem with one person dealing with that in all the cemeteries I've ever dealt with. And this guy really didn't like anybody come on his property. And he basically said to these little old ladies who wanted to come up there, say, yes, you can come to the property in the middle of August, but you have to park your car at the gate and you have to walk to 3 miles back to the cemetery in the middle of August. So you think that these little old ladies are going to be doing that? No, they're not, and sometimes people just give up on that. But there are laws in place to keep people from keeping family members out. But in those laws, there's also responsibilities of the family members they'd have to take to be able to get in there and clean the graves, to fix them up, that type thing. What happens is sometimes these cemeteries are not known about, forgotten about, especially in the African-American cemeteries. What happens with a lot of them is after Jim Crow really got to full effect, a lot of families, they call it the Great Exodus, where a lot of people start going to North Carolina, New York, and Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, and Chicago, and everything. And then you have a generation or two go through there and not pass on the information about these cemeteries in Charleston. The next thing you know, that cemetery is gone and lost until it's rediscovered. And like me doing it and then finding the family and reacquainting them with the cemetery. But then when you get to the cemetery, come to find out that it's been out of sight, out of mind for so long, and people have plowed it over, or they've moved grave markers. Case in point, the 88 Smith Street property we're dealing with. That thing had been buried into from 1817 to 1934. Graves have been put in there. And when we went on the behest of a possible purchaser of the property and went back, the people that had previously owned the house, sometime between 1936 and today, I can't tell you who did it or which one did it, but sometime between that period, one of the homeowners took the gravestones and paved the back sidewalk with gravestones, made a barbecue grill out of gravestones, and really desecrated the cemetery by moving these gravestones around. And it was really horrifying to see that. Now, if you see in churches that move them and put them, cement them into the walls because of, size, or, something gets moved around, that type thing. But these people were actually taking gravestones, putting them in there and using them as sidewalks and cooking barbecue on top of some, that type thing. And it was horrible to see that. So, but people do that thinking, oh, the family's not going to say anything because there's nobody coming this long. They're not going to come anytime. But all of a sudden, 30 years later, somebody comes and guess what? They find their family cemetery is desecrated. So there is that. So if these people, if we could determine the people that are buried in there, or the possibility of people buried in there, if the families want to go there and see them, then that's something that we'll have to take up with the, it can be either the family or a representative of the family. Like myself, I'm doing genealogical research or historical research for the family, but I have to have a letter notarized or endorsed with me from the family saying that I'm there and I can be there and do that. But then I have to take the same steps by notifying. Now, almost all the cemeteries I've ever dealt with never had to go to that level. You'd go to the private property and say, hey, you know, the cemetery. Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Come on in, look at the cemetery. And it's always been word of mouth ever since. As you know, and there's a lot of cemeteries I know that are out there that I have not gone on because I can never get a hold of the person that's privately owned it, or it's owned by somebody out of the state or out of the country. So there is that law in effect.
Anybody else? Any questions? This is fascinating stuff. I didn't realize there were so many out here, especially over by Beresford Creek. That's cool.
Yeah, and something else we've been working on, the Anson Street Burial Ground project. We found the remains of the remains were anywhere between 1740 and 1750 to 1770, 1780, something like that. And through ancient DNA testing and through strontium radiation level testing in the bones, that type thing, we were able to determine who had been born in Africa and shipped to the States and who had been born in the States, and about how long the people that were in Africa had been living in the States, strictly by the strontium radiation level readings in the bones. Now, strontium radiation levels everywhere, and as you eat stuff from the area, drink stuff from the area, that it'll leave a certain imprint in your bones. And then if you go to another area, then it's like tree rings. You know, you'll have the older stuff, but as the newer stuff comes in, the older stuff starts going away. And you can obviously see that was older. So you can get an idea on how long they've been in country, per se. And the DNA, they have these DNA database that's basically like fingerprints that are different geographic regions have these different DNA readings, and you could take this stuff and get a generalized idea of the geographic region from where these people came from, or where these people's ancestors came from. And in some instances, if you have one that was from Mozambique on the east coast of Africa, and I have a list of slave ships that came in and out of Charleston from 1700 to 1810, if you only had 5 ships in that entire period of time that ever made that trip to Mozambique, and they were all spread out, and this person died sometime between 1740 and 1750, and this boat had made a trip in 1739, there's a pretty good possibility that that boat is the one that person came in on. So there's a lot of information out there, and we had our first paper published concerning it, and it's really fascinating. And we're in the process of doing our second paper concerning the dental calculus, the plaque and stuff on the teeth, determining what they ate and different things like that. So that will be coming out sometime in the next year or two.
That is absolutely fascinating. I had no idea, just hearing not only your research, but also the science behind how some of these things are dated. That's just really incredible.
Yeah, and the stuff they did with the Anson Street project this kind of research has never been done before. They've done research on other graves and everything, but the type of DNA research is done is some groundbreaking stuff that's never been done before. And this past, I don't know whether it's quarterly or monthly, but this past issue of one of the big magazines in the DNA world or whatever, we were on the front page in the big story in the magazine about what we had done. Now, of course, we're a team, but we have some doctors from the University of Pennsylvania that have been doing this. We didn't do it, but you know, we had been assisting with trying to find records on these people, and because they know the technical stuff, but they don't know the boots on the ground, you know, technical stuff here, like helping in the city or different things or geographic regions and that type thing. So it's a conglomeration of it all. But you know, whoever is involved in it is a published author on the paper, and I'm one of those.
Yeah, I have that paper.
Okay.
It's very well written and it's fascinating.
Yes, it is. It is like, you know, in it was like, now I was there at Brockington Associates when we packaged the bones up, and looking at these bones, it was very, very, the older woman that in her teeth, she had a hole where she had constantly bitten down on a clay pipe. So she had this hole between the two between her teeth right here, worn in, where she could actually keep her teeth clenched and put the pipe through the hole. I mean, it was just stuff like that. And one of the boys that was found had actually coins on his eyes. It was, you know, there was, it's interesting stuff, you know, and really looking at these people and looking at the remains and looking at, see that their teeth and their bones and the joints and everything, how arthritic they were, and if they had any breaks and healed breaks or fractures, that type thing. You looking at them, they had been through the ringer, so they had well worn. So this next test we're doing, hopefully will turn a lot of their diet. A lot of the dental was really bad stuff, so you could tell they had a high starchy diet, like rice and potatoes, that type thing, and probably syrup, sugary, that type thing. So their teeth were not very well at all. None of them were.
An attendee asked where you can read that paper. I'll talk to Bill and I'll see if we can get it put in the notes after this program. But if you just
absolutely, because I think the link to the thing is for 2 weeks you're able to get it, but now I think you have to buy it. But I have I have a digitized document of it, and if you don't have it or if you've got it, I can always send you a copy of it. And if anybody wants to take my email down, they're more than welcome to contact me, and I'll be more than happy to connect with them afterwards and send them whatever.
Yep, I'll get with Bill afterwards and see if we can post that up somewhere so that people can take a look.
I'll send you an email and see if maybe we can figure that out, because I know that's something that we would definitely be interested in reading more about. And even your presentation, if there's any information you'd like to pass on. I know obviously we have some members that are interested in collaborating or talking with you about what they may know. So I would be happy to connect you with them if for some reason someone wanted to reach out. I'm more than happy to do that as well. I know Beth as well has your contact information.
And one of the things, like the Grove Cemetery behind the tennis center, there's probably a handful of gravestones in there. I think 12 or 15 or something like that. But I think I have 120 people listed as being buried in there, or 100 something being buried in there. So there are a lot of unmarked graves in there. And in fact, when Dr. O passed away, I'm the one that dug his grave with a backhoe. It was a thing that we talked about a long time ago, and I made a promise to him that said, man, if you ever die before me, I'm gonna dig your grave. And I kept my promise. I went there and dug his grave. And where we put it at was right smack dab in the middle of the cemetery, but we were afraid that we were gonna open up another grave or hit another grave. And the very first scoop that we did, we had just breached the side of a grave shaft. So it was just the dirt, you know, we weren't down to the bones or nothing. So, and we found a piece of porcelain that was in the dirt. So we basically took the porcelain out, took pictures of it, put it back in there, and we moved back 2 feet and then dug, and we had no issues whatsoever. And we got in about 2 feet, and then the last 4 feet was this hard, thick clay that was just unbelievable. It took us like almost an hour and a half to dig through that, to dig the grave itself with the Kubota tractor, and that was interesting. But that whole area is full of graves. Now with those country cemeteries, lots of times those country cemeteries tend to expand outside of the listed boundaries or what the listed boundary is today. So there might be graves outside of that fence that's there now. You know, far, you know, we have no idea, but we have ground penetrating radar that, you know, we could bring over there and scan it, you know, and tell where, if there's anomalies that are indicative of graves. But I would imagine the majority of them would be inside the fence there, because that's a rather large area.
Well, thank you so much for giving us your time and enlightening us on the research you've done. It's really incredible how much research you've done and how relevant this is and how important this is for our community. And I hope that if anyone is interested in reaching out, please go through Beth or I. We're happy to connect you. This is something that I know will continue to expand as you continue your research. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about everything that you've uncovered here. It's really impressive.
Yeah, any little information, no information is bad information. Any information, you might have something about a cemetery or where you think one might be at, pass that information on. The worst it could be is we already know about it, or there is nothing there once we check it. But the sheer fact that is you think there's possibility of something there, then we can check it. And that's how we find a lot of our graves. And then I'm constantly going through old plat maps. I have a 1 terabyte hard drive that is full of nothing but old plat maps with graves on them, just grave markers, or that type, cemeteries and different things, and just the logistics of looking how a road went to see, and it's a lot of reading old plat records and deeds. That so it's an acquired taste. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you again, and I hopefully this will open a line of communication for if we have any members that can help you out with your research, and I hope that you'll come back in the future and tell us about what you've learned at a later date as well. This is something that I think we definitely want to keep tabs on and find out, in our community what's going on with these very relevant issues and these cases that are coming up. So we appreciate the time you've taken, and thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you for having me.
And I would like to remind everyone this is the last meeting we have for until we come back after summer, but we will continue to have interesting information put out on our Facebook page and social media. And Grant, any information you have you'd like to pass on, we would love to share information you have, any articles you have, anything relevant that you think our members would be interested in. Bill does a great job of trying to link some current events that are going on as well as some historical records. So I know that he would be interested in any information you have to pass on through our Facebook page. So,
okay.
But yeah, we appreciate it and thank you. We hope that, information we can go back and talk about and readdress at a later date. And yeah, I hope that you have a wonderful night. And I imagine you will get some contacts and some additional questions from us, and we appreciate in advance you taking the time to teach us about these topics.
Thanks. Real quick, before this is over with, after this is over with, if Mr. Dahlman to stay on the line, I'm going to ask him a few questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to stop the recording now. So anybody who wants to get off can, but that way you guys can, you and Bill can, or you and Mike can talk about the cemetery.
Okay.
Thank you, Grant.